The respiratory bud is an embryological structure of endodermal origin that develops into organs of the respiratory system, such as the larynx, trachea and lungs. Early stage. In the 4th week of development, the respiratory bud starts to grow from the ventral side of the mid-foregut into the mesoderm that surrounds it, taking the form of a pouch. Around the 28th day, 2 lung buds develop on the sides of the distal part of the respiratory bud and begin to grow laterally, expanding into the primitive pleural cavity. Molecular signaling. The molecular signaling involved in the specification of the respiratory bud starts with the expression of the NBX2-1 gene, which determines the respiratory field, the area where the respiratory bud will begin to grow from. The signaling that makes the growth of the respiratory bud possible is complex and involves a number of interactions between the mesoderm and the respiratory bud epithelium, in which members of the FGF and FGFR family of genes express separation of trachea and esophagus. At first, the posterior part of the trachea is open to the esophagus, but as the bud elongates, 2 longitudinal mesodermal ridges begin to form and grow until they join, forming a wall between the 2 organs. An incomplete separation of the organs leads to a congenital abnormality known as a tracheoesophageal fistula. Larynx development. The epithelium of the larynx is of endodermal origin, but the laryngeal cartilages, unlike the rest of the respiratory bud connective tissue, come from the mesenchyma of the 4th and 6th pharyngeal arches. The 4th pharyngeal arch, adjacent to what will be the root of the tongue, will become the epiglottis. The 6th pharyngeal arch, located around the laryngeal orifice, will become the thyroid, cricoid and arytenoid cartilages. These structures are formed in a process in which the lining cells of the primitive larynx proliferate and occlude it. Later, it recanalizes, leaving 2 membrane-like structures, the vocal folds and the vestibular folds. In between, an enlarged space, the ventricle, remains. Failure in this process leads to a serious but rare condition called congenital atresia of the larynx. Later development. After the lung buds have formed, they begin to grow and branch, forming a primitive version of the bronchial tree, determining how the lobes of the lung will be arranged in the mature organ. The first stage of alveolar development, spanning between the 5th and the 16th week of development, is called the pseudo-glandular stage. It is so called because of the histological appearance of the primitive alveoli, which resemble glandular tissue. After the pseudo-glandular stage, the lung enters the canalicular and saccular phases. During these stages, the terminal tubes narrow and give rise to small sacculus, which become increasingly associated with capillaries as to make gas exchange possible. The alveolar epithelium begins to differentiate into 2 distinct types of cells, type 1 pneumocytes and type 2 pneumocytes, as well as the respiratory epithelium of the trachea and bronchial tree.